In the annals of ancient Greek history, there exists a city-state whose name became synonymous with unyielding will and unparalleled military valor, Sparta. Its inhabitants were renowned as exceptional warriors, and their military exploits and achievements are shrouded in countless legends passed down through generations. Of course, for many, the iconic scene from a popular film immediately comes to mind, where a mighty king, embodying the full power and uncompromising spirit of Sparta, dramatically hurls an opponent into an abyss, exclaiming a legendary phrase that has become a symbol of resolve. All of this is undoubtedly captivating and inspires contemplation. However, behind these vivid, sometimes mythologized images lies an authentic history, far deeper and more multifaceted than it might seem at first glance. What among these gripping tales corresponds to reality, and what is a product of artistic invention? What undeniable facts do we know about the true history of Sparta, its structure, and its influence on the ancient world? What words, idiomatic expressions, or even daily customs have reached us across millennia, carrying echoes of the Spartan spirit? Prepare for a deep dive into the true mysteries of Sparta, to discover the indelible legacy it left behind, and why its influence is still felt today. Sparta, located in the southern part of the Peloponnese Peninsula, in the territory known as Laconia, was also called Lacedaemon. It was the Greek letter, lambda, that adorned the renowned Spartan shields. Founded approximately in the 11th century BCE, the city was a unique entity, organized on the principle of a military camp, where war and combat readiness were elevated to an absolute cult. A notable dialogue recounts a Spartan king being asked why Sparta had no walls, to which he replied that their walls were spears, and their borders were their points. Another monarch asserted that a Spartan was not interested in the number of enemies, only their location. Sparta was governed by two kings, an unusual but practical solution. During wartime, they could operate on two fronts, while in peacetime, they mutually restrained each other, preventing the establishment of tyranny. However, their functions within Sparta itself were relatively limited. An advisory body to the kings was the Council of Geronts, or elders, consisting of 28 men. They drafted proposals, while the final decisions on crucial matters such as declaring war or concluding peace, and the election of officials, belonged to the Apella, the popular assembly comprising all Spartiates. Remarkably, decisions were made not through discussion, but rather primitively, by approval or rejection via shouts. For example, elections to the Council of Elders proceeded as follows: the people gathered before a locked house, and candidates were brought out one by one. The people's greeting was expressed by shouting, while inside the house, people with writing tablets, unable to see the candidates, merely recorded the loudness of the shouts. The one who received the loudest shouts was considered elected. A similar method is used today in jesting competitions to determine a winner by the strength of applause. Furthermore, Sparta had a very specific oversight body, the Ephorate, designed to ensure the inviolability and execution of Lycurgan laws. 5 ephors, or overseers, were elected annually, possessing broad powers, even to the extent of removing kings from power. The Lycurgan laws represent a peculiar phenomenon in Spartan legislation, characterized by the absence of lawmaking in its usual sense. According to tradition, these laws were given to Sparta in ancient times by Lycurgus, who was probably one of the kings, but the Spartans themselves revered him more as a god than a man. A temple was even built for him, where sacrifices were offered. Plutarch noted the extreme inaccuracy of information about the legislator Lycurgus. Of the legislator Lycurgus, nothing strictly trustworthy can be related, concerning his origin, his travels and death, as well as his laws and the constitution he gave the state. There exist the most contradictory accounts. But most of all, information differs as to when he lived. Legend has it that, having bestowed laws upon Sparta, Lycurgus ensured their eternity and immutability. He announced his intention to go to Delphi to consult the will of Apollo and extracted an oath from the Spartans not to change the laws until his return. The Spartans, of course, swore. Lycurgus then departed for Delphi and there, apparently, deliberately perished. He even bequeathed that his body be burned and his ashes scattered over the sea, so that even his remains would never return to Sparta. Thus, Sparta's laws remained unchanged forever. Spartan society was divided into three classes: Spartiates, Perioeci, and Helots. The Spartiates were descendants of the conquerors, while the Perioeci and Helots were the subjugated population. Accordingly, the former governed and waged wars, the Perioeci engaged in weapon manufacturing and paid taxes, the Helots cultivated the land. Neither the Perioeci nor the Helots possessed any civil rights, effectively serving the Spartiates, who numbered about 9,000 families. This was a relatively small number, comparable to the population of a modern residential complex. All the land of Laconia was divided among them into 9,000 equal allotments. Spartiates prided themselves on their status as a society of equals, yet the Helots, essentially state slaves, were not accounted for at all, even though they outnumbered the Spartiates tenfold. It is evident that the Helots harbored deep hatred for the Spartiates. If the Spartiates had forgotten their constant state of war for even a day, Sparta would have been destroyed. And they did not forget, they ate and slept with a spear in hand. All statues of gods in Sparta, even the statue of the goddess Aphrodite, were depicted holding spears. Towards the Helots, any cruelty was considered justified and normal. Moreover, Spartiates periodically organized so-called punitive raids with the aim of killing young Helots. Firstly, this reduced the risk of rebellion, and secondly, it accustomed young Spartiates to despise the oppressed and not fear cruelty towards them. Around the 8th century BCE, other Greek polis entered a period of so-called Greek colonization. Due to a shortage of fertile land, they first explored the Aegean, and then the Mediterranean basins, establishing colonies along the coasts. Beyond their primary goal, this fostered the development of trade and introduced the Greeks to other cultures. This period saw the first mentions of stories about the Argonauts and Odysseus, everything connected with long voyages and tales of overseas lands. Overall, this period brought much benefit to all Greeks, and to the rest of the world as well. For example, it was thanks to this that grapevines found their way to the south of modern France. However, the Spartans did not follow this path. They preferred to plunder the local population and conserve their culture, interacting with the outside world solely through war. They completely lacked a navy. When they faced food problems, they simply advanced further into the Peloponnese, conquering neighbors and turning their inhabitants into Helots. Thus began the First Messenian War. A century later, in the second half of the 7th century BCE, the Messenians revolted under the leadership of Aristomenes, leading to the Second Messenian War. But despite the support of the Arcadian polis and the Argives, the Messenians were defeated and remained enslaved. Regarding occupations, there is a widespread belief that in Sparta, everyone was a warrior, old men, women, and children. This is partly true and partly not. Children first had to receive a specific, regulated upbringing, and only then go to war. As for women, contrary to popular belief, they did not fight. Their significant function was to bear and raise warriors. There is a legend about this: a Spartan woman, having sent 5 sons to battle, waited for news at the gates. Upon the arrival of a messenger, she asked, "How are things?" "All 5 are killed." "That's not what I'm asking." "Who won?" "We won." "Then I am happy that they died." This demonstrates the priority of victory over personal tragedy. However, it would be a mistake to consider that women in Sparta were merely incubators for producing military force. Although they had no civil rights, which was characteristic of most Greek polis, Spartan women were in many ways a match for their husbands, courageous, strong, hardened, and, so to speak, unpretentious. When men were at war, which happened frequently, given Sparta's nature, women had to be able to defend themselves, as the Helots constantly posed a threat. Therefore, training such as running, wrestling, javelin throwing, and the like was mandatory for them. They were by no means reclusive, engaged only in household chores. They participated in civic life, and their opinions were respected. There is another legend about this. King Leonidas's wife was once told that only in Sparta do husbands obey their wives. To which she replied, "Only in Sparta do wives give birth to real men." This scene, incidentally, is present in the film 300. Regarding childbirth, the marriage age for girls was restricted, no younger than 18. At the same time, same-sex female love and even polyandry were possible. For example, two brothers could have one wife, or if a husband was old and his wife young, he could himself choose a worthy man and bring him into the house. In such cases, the child from such a union remained with the husband. Male same-sex love was also in no way condemned. Moreover, Spartans considered it an important element in the upbringing of warriors, believing that it instilled a special love that allowed them to fight successfully shoulder to shoulder. Young men were allowed to marry upon reaching the age of 20, but until 30, they had to live in barracks with their peers, coming to their wives only at night. After 30, a man became a full citizen. Every citizen had to have a son. Bachelors were extremely disliked and humiliated in every way, even forced to walk naked in cold weather. Now, let's return to the question of who fought. Old men. Yes, they fought too. There are several stories about this. A lame Spartan went to war, saying, "I go not to run, but to fight." A blind Spartan went to war, explaining, "To blunt the enemy's sword on myself." An old Spartan went to war to shield the young. As for men in their prime, there were no alternatives for them. The only permissible occupation for a man was war. Labor was the lot of the Perioeci and Helots. Once, Sparta gathered allies for a military campaign. Having assembled, they set up camp, and the allies began to grumble that Sparta, being the instigator, had sent the fewest warriors. The Spartan king objected, seated the Spartan army to his right and the allies to his left, and then began to say, "Stand up, potter. Stand up, carpenter." And so on. By the end of the list, almost all the allies were standing. Among the Spartans, not a single one stood up. "You see," said the king, "we alone provide true warriors." A little more about discipline. Spartans were the first to learn to fight in formation, in a phalanx, rather than each man for himself, as everyone else did. Leaving one's place in the formation was considered the most terrible crime, regardless of whether the warrior was running towards the enemy or away from the enemy. The Spartan phalanx was long considered invincible. Discipline was paramount. A Spartan who had raised his sword against an enemy, upon hearing the retreat signal, would withdraw it. Better to leave the enemy alive than to disobey a command. And another anecdote, a boy ran away from a training camp to war and fought bravely. He was given wine for his bravery and flogged with rods for violating discipline. Next is a most interesting phenomenon, monetary relations within Sparta. They essentially had no money, and for ideological reasons. The absence of money was supposed to exclude luxury and temptations. The roof of a house had to be made only with an axe, the door only with a saw. There is a story that once, Spartans, finding themselves in Corinth, saw plastered ceilings and asked, "Do you really have square trees growing here?" So alien were they to any manifestations of wealth. Iron bars served as money, of which a whole bag had to be carried for a small purchase. This was not their invention, it was common throughout Greece, but other Greeks quickly transitioned to coins of different denominations, while Spartans purposefully and consciously maintained these iron bars. Moreover, they even specially hardened this iron in vinegar to make it brittle and essentially useless. It could not be reforged into anything. Thus, technically, money existed, trade was possible, but no one particularly engaged in it or accumulated money. In general, the pursuit of wealth was considered shameful. One might think, how admirable. But ultimately, this led exclusively to an ascetic way of life. This very phrase, Spartan lifestyle, which has become entrenched in language, also applied to food. Spartans ate not in their homes, but in barracks. The main dish was black broth with lentils, vinegar, and salt. It was very nutritious but extremely unpleasant in taste. Spartans were very proud of it. There is a story that a Persian king once asked a captured Spartan to cook him such a broth. He cooked it, and, tasting it, the king said, "Now I understand why Spartans bravely go to their death, they prefer death to such food." Next, Remember Chekhov's famous, brevity is the sister of talent? Well, the Spartans also had something to say about this. In war, one was supposed to express oneself in a military manner, clearly and distinctly. Verbosity was condemned. If someone rambled, they were immediately interrupted, even if they were speaking sense. This ability to express thoughts very briefly but succinctly was and still is called laconicism, named after the region of Laconia. There are many different stories about this. 3 of the most notable can be given. The first is an utterance by a Spartan woman accompanying her son to war. She handed him his shield and said, "With it or on it." Victors returned with their shields, the fallen were carried on them. The second, a Spartan came as an envoy to the Macedonian king. "Are you alone?" asked the king, accustomed to grand delegations. "To one," replied the Spartan. This expression is very common today. The only thing is, most seem to think that one-to-one means something perfectly matching, but in reality, it signifies the absence of unnecessary frills. And finally, the third, much later, when Sparta already had walls, not spears. When Philip of Macedon, father of Alexander the Great, came to the walls of Sparta and said, "I have conquered all of Greece, and I have the best army in the world. Surrender. Because if I take Sparta by force, if I break its gates, if I smash its walls with a battering ram, I will mercilessly destroy all the inhabitants and level the city to the ground." To which the Spartans calmly replied, "If." Now, here's a question, is it true that children were killed in Sparta? It seems so, yes, it's true. A newborn Spartan child was brought to the council of elders, examined, and if the child was deemed frail and sickly, it was killed, thrown into some chasm not far from Sparta. Only strong and healthy children were to grow up in Sparta. It is important to note that archaeologists have not found chasms full of bones. Therefore, there is no direct evidence for this. However, for a number of reasons, researchers believe that this was the case, at least at some particular stage. Regarding upbringing, at the age of 7, a child left home and settled with peers in barracks. Incidentally, from ancient times, the threshold when a child was considered ready for any education other than home schooling was 7 years. Today, children are sent to school at 7, and any psychologist will say that this is not by chance. So, in the barracks, children learn to live the Spartan way, enduring a mass of artificially created hardships. They ate meagerly, wore only one chiton year-round, and slept on hard reeds, which had to be gathered with bare hands. Once a year, they were all whipped with rods at the altar of Artemis. They had to endure the flogging without a single groan, and it was severe, not everyone even survived it. They learned, of course, primarily combat and wrestling. Spartans were forbidden from participating in the Olympic Games. Sparta needed warriors, not athletes. Incidentally, this is a very interesting and important difference between Spartans and other Greeks. For all others, sport, athletic achievements, and good physical form were considered obligatory and a guarantee of success in war, while for Spartans, on the contrary, mere sport as such remained an excess that distracted from real fighting. In general, one of the most important lessons for Spartans was not to bother with trifles. In addition to daily military training, boys were taught to cope with various difficulties of military life. In particular, they were taught to steal. The idea of an army being followed by an equal number of squires and supply wagons was completely alien to Sparta. What you acquired, you ate. Those who came empty-handed were beaten. Those caught red-handed were also beaten. And here is another heartbreaking story: a boy stole a fox cub. Someone approached him, and he hid the fox cub under his cloak. The fox cub gnawed into his stomach. The boy stood firm and spoke in a calm voice. He was not suspected, and the fox cub gnawed through his internal organs. His act was recounted to children as a heroic deed. Such was Spartan upbringing. Much later, at the wane of Sparta's power, the Macedonian king asked for 50 boys as hostages. The Spartans said, "Better take adults. We do not want the boys to return to us untrained in the Spartan way." Now, what is the conclusion from all this? Once, Sparta did not stand out among other Greek polis. Art flourished there, poetry thrived. Laconian painted pottery and bronze casting were considered among the best in Greece. Recall Greek mythology and poetry. Helen of Troy was a Spartan queen. In that era, there were no symptoms yet of what Sparta would later become. Indeed, Helen, Menelaus, her sister Clytemnestra, and the brothers Dioscuri, all these well-known characters of Greek mythology, of the Trojan War in particular, are all, albeit mythical, ancestors of the conquered peoples, the Helots, whom the Spartans abused. At what point did the transformation begin? It must be assumed that the Messenian Wars were the cause. When Sparta chose the path of oppressing its neighbors, it seemingly won, but these defeated people were many times, tens of times, more numerous. And in order to maintain their acquired power, to sustain their pressure, their way of life, it required the exertion of an entire people's strength. They could not afford to relax, let alone engage in anything other than maintaining the established order. That is, all the forces of Spartan society were directed towards preserving the system and suppressing the oppressed layers of the population. And, of course, Lycurgus's reforms, which, in essence, simply fossilized society within itself and halted development. The Spartans were terribly proud of their way of life and laws, surely believing themselves to be the strongest and most remarkable. However, from this moment until Roman times, Sparta gave the world no artists, scholars, poets, or philosophers. All crafts degenerated to a primitive state, except for war. When one reads about Spartan discipline, and primarily about discipline itself, about the ability to concentrate, not to be distracted by trifles, and all these amusing stories, a certain respect arises. But when one tries to convert this into what it cost both the oppressed population and the Spartiates themselves, all this charm immediately crumbles. Sparta ultimately gave nothing to the world. Even these stories that were told were mostly, and perhaps entirely, written by Athenians, which raises some questions about their reliability, because Athens was Sparta's main enemy all along. Moreover, the Spartiates were a very closed society, foreigners were not allowed to live there, and they themselves did not tell anyone much, so everything written about them may be mythologized to some extent. But the point is that nothing remains of Sparta, and there is nowhere special to go and see. Sparta's cultural heritage is zero. What, in fact, was the end result? Sparta very much wanted to defeat its old enemy, Athens. Moreover, the Greeks understood well that this was not just a struggle between two polis for territory or resources, it was a struggle of ideologies. Athens was the complete opposite of Sparta. It was an open city, it had democracy, it welcomed anyone who wished to settle in Athens if they were willing to abide by local laws and contribute to society. They developed theater, philosophy, science, and art. At the same time, Athens was not only the cultural but also the financial center of that world. So, Sparta very much wanted to defeat Athens, to prove that their way of life was better and more correct. And at some point, Sparta succeeded. However, to say that it was a glorious victory of the valiant, one could not bring oneself to say it. Because for victory, they resorted to the help of the ancient and sworn enemy of all Greeks, the Persians. The Spartans understood that to defeat Athens, they needed a fleet, and they went to the Persians to ask for money. The very same Persians whom they had defeated just a few decades earlier at the Battle of Thermopylae. That is, they completely disregarded the heroic deed of King Leonidas and everything associated with it, and went to ask for money. Well, the Persians gave them money. The Spartans built a fleet, and thanks to this, Sparta won the Peloponnesian War, which was, in general, destructive, with no real victors, but nevertheless Sparta declared its hegemony. Well, that was also a kind of victory. Firstly, as already mentioned, it was a prolonged war that demanded many resources, expenses, and much effort from each side. And secondly, after defeating Athens, Sparta became a financial center, money flowed into it. And it was then that it turned out that the ascetic warriors were not as steadfast against luxury and wealth as they wanted to believe themselves to be. Inequality began among them, some Spartiates began to seize land from others. That is, in fact, they very quickly transformed from a society of equals into a standard, rather unpleasant oligarchy. Ultimately, impoverished Spartiates became mercenaries, and gradually all of Sparta turned into a state supplying warriors, who were hired by anyone who needed them. They themselves stood firm for a long time, trying to maintain their image. Yes, this is Sparta. But their numbers dwindled. At some point, nature could not but intervene. A very destructive earthquake occurred, in which many Spartiates perished. Naturally, as soon as this happened, panic broke out. Many dead, and immediately the Helots revolted. This was the Third Messenian War. Although they did not gain freedom at this moment, they nevertheless severely battered Spartan society, which was, in general, quite predictable. The oppressed never give up, they always await only the opportune moment, and, indeed, nature itself provided them with this opportunity. They did not become free at this moment, but this entire chain of events prepared and hastened the end of Sparta. And a rather inglorious end it was. Sparta lost its power, its, albeit strange and perverse, but distinctive way of life. In 195 BCE, in the Laconic War, Sparta finally fell, leaving, as already mentioned, no cultural product that would endure through the ages. And in 146 BCE, like other Greek polis, it was absorbed by Rome. What the defeated Athens left to the world was, evidently, much more. Such is the story. Conclusions should be drawn independently.